Season 11 is almost here, and with it comes one of the most important, and one of the scariest, updates in the finals history. A complete Melee rework. The issue is that Embark hasn't actually told us much about what that rework looks like. However, while the developers haven't revealed any concrete details, they did still reveal something important during the Season 10 AMA. Their philosophy.
So we're trying to almost go back to scratch and build that loop up.
Right.
And ideally that would be a loop that can work for all of the melee weapons. And then on the foundation of that combat loop, you do little specializations for different weapons and different items that make them distinct from each other. And so often what happens is, as a gun user getting attacked by a melee user, you end up in this position that you're just getting, like, somebody appeared out of nowhere, they're on top of you and just mash, right? That's not fun for the victim. It's not really a huge amount of fun for the melee user necessarily if it's just spamming the button. And so the approach we're taking is, can we build more complete loops for those kind of combat encounters? Like, how does a gun player get to fight back in a way that feels fair against a melee user when the melee user gets on top of them? How does the melee user get payoff for having closed distance in a really skillful way?
At first glance, these comments don't reveal much, but buried within them are several clues about the direction Embark seems to be heading. They don't tell us what the rework will contain, but they do tell us what the problems are that the devs are trying to solve. And if we understand the problems, then we can maybe start predicting the solutions. So, let's give it a shot.
And I think what we feel like with the way we approach melee from the start of the game through to now, we've never really defined what a melee combat loop looks like, those two 1v1, or a melee versus ranged user fight ends up playing like.
For most of the AMA, Matt focuses on melee versus ranged combat. But the fact that he specifically calls out melee v melee combat suggests that the developers may be exploring ways to make those interactions more structured and nuanced. This could look like a simplified parry system, or a form of counterattacks. This could be a decent change by making melee v melee duels more engaging, and by increasing skill expression. However, I fear that it could easily fall into unnecessary complexity and feel out of place in an FPS game. And while Matt's comment does suggest that the team has at least thought about melee v melee combat, I don't see enough evidence to suggest that it is a major focus of the rework. And for that reason, I think this is one of the less likely predictions on this list.
And so often what happens is, as a gun user getting attacked by a melee user, you end up in this position that you're just getting, like, somebody appeared out of nowhere, they're on top of you and just mash, right? That's not fun for the victim.
The phrase appeared out of nowhere sounds, to me, like less of a balance concern and more like a readability concern. The developers may have concluded that melee needs to be more visible and readable. Rather than changing how melee functions mechanically, Embark may instead decide that players simply need better information before a melee engagement begins. So I could see them implementing louder footsteps for melee weapons, or even melee-specific weapon audio cues. This is actually an idea that I pitched in my video showing how I'd redesign melee, which you should watch right after this one. This could definitely be a good change, as it helps melee from being seen as something that is impossible to fight against if you don't have strong spatial awareness skills. However, it should also be done carefully, so as to not straight up eliminate stealth.
And then some people that use melee are like, dude, I have to try so much, I have to learn all these bits of tech that, to be honest, we don't really want those, exploits to be in the game.
This is one of the clearest, most overt statements featured in the AMA. Matt explicitly identifies melee tech as something Embark is uncomfortable with. Historically, Embark nerfed the sledgehammer with the specific emphasis on removing all of its quick melee combos. They nerfed the Riot Shield's ability to interrupt enemies' line of sight to cancel cash-out steals. They nerfed the dagger by removing its ability to backstab objects like goo and turrets. So, why isn't this premise listed higher, you might ask? Well, the reason is that it all depends on what Embark is referring to when they say tech. Now, on one hand, the only form of prominent tech that still exists for melee at this point is the quick melee combo, so his statement could be directly talking about that. However, they've also been relatively permissive of these combos in many of the other melee weapons for a long while now, so it could just be a general statement without any meaningful plans accompanying it at this time. The removal of quick melee combos, if implemented this coming season, would in my opinion be a terrible change. It would lower the barrier to entry, but that isn't really a concern anybody has for melee. What people are concerned about is the lower skill ceiling, lack of attack options, and loss of long-standing melee knowledge. I suspect that this change, if implemented, would be poorly received by many of the game's dedicated melee players. However, I could definitely see other, more niche melee tech, like animation cancelling out of the spear's secondary spin attack, being removed in this melee rework. So in that regard, I do think this prediction is pretty likely.
Somebody appeared out of nowhere, they're on top of you and just mash, right? That's not fun for the victim, and it's not really a huge amount of fun for the melee user necessarily if it's just spamming the button.
The repeated emphasis on mash suggests that Embark believes melee to lack proper decision-making opportunities after contact. And the devs could address this by introducing things like charge-based attacks, longer recovery windows, or more attack chains. This would require Embark to uproot some of melee's current attacks, which would definitely be a risky play on their part. This change could be good, as more decision-making opportunities is always good in FPS games, especially for melee given its tendency to be simplified into one type of attack. Giving its users multiple options when it comes to fights would generally be received well. However, it also runs the risk of having slower gameplay, reduced fluidity, and less responsive combat if fights are now bogged down by slower and clunkier charged attacks or things like that.
And so the approach we're taking is, can we build more complete loops for those kind of combat encounters? How does a gun player get to fight back in a way that feels fair against a melee user when the melee user gets on top of them? How does the melee user get payoff for having closed distance in a really skillful way? How else can they close distance so that is a skill in its own right?
In my opinion, this is the most revealing excerpt from the entire AMA livestream. Matt is specifically positing the idea that gun users should have an opportunity to fight back against melee users after the melee user reaches them. This strongly suggests that Embark is wanting additional interaction after successful engagement. Notice that Matt isn't asking how gun users could prevent melee from reaching them. He's asking how they can fight back after they've already been reached. This could manifest as pushback mechanics or staggers, something that would probably be akin to a quick melee. This could also end up being a way to stun or interrupt and escape from a melee attack. This concept, in and of itself, is not a bad idea. It allows for more agency for ranged users, and it would probably help out newer players when dealing with more skilled melee players, which could result in a greater perception of fairness. However, this very quickly runs the risk of something that Matt also noted: the reduction of melee payoff. If the pushback mechanic is too simple to pull off, then melee will perform much worse in mid to high level lobbies. If it is too difficult to pull off, then melee will still perform worse in higher level lobbies, but no change will be present in lower level ones. So, while the idea itself is good, I question how well it can be implemented in practice. Now, this prediction is actually not derived from the AMA livestream at all. In fact, It comes from an accident on Embark's part. You see, in Update 10.3.0, all melee weapons lost the ability to quick melee combo. Now, the next day, Embark dropped a hotfix in which they reversed this change, citing it as an issue that caused quick melee attacks to be delayed in conjunction with melee attacks. Now, this absolutely could have been nothing more than an unrelated bug. In fact, this is probably the most likely explanation. But I do find it interesting that the one mechanic affected was quick melee combos, a piece of melee tech that the devs specifically criticized during the AMA and elsewhere. Whether that's merely a coincidence or an accidental glimpse into a mismerged branch working on Season 11 melee development, we cannot know. But it's enough to make me wonder whether quick melee combos are on the chopping block. Ultimately, these are just predictions. Maybe Season 11's melee rework looks nothing like this. Maybe Embark completely surprises us. Maybe we'll all just wake up and realize it was nothing but a bad dream. But based upon what little information they've publicly shared over the past several months, these are the directions that I think they're most likely to take. Whether Season 11 ends up rebuilding melee from the ground up, or simply refining what's already there, we'll know soon enough.